Good afternoon. We will now proceed with our fourth panel, researchers and policy experts. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm going to give you some details about how this is going to run. Each panelist is going to have 7 minutes to speak. After each panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted time period, and I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I will strictly enforce the time allotments given to each panelist to present his or her statement, and unless we did not receive your testimony until today, you may assume that we have read it. So feel free to summarize it, and we will appreciate that so you can make the best use of the 7 minutes you've been allotted. Please focus your remarks on the topic of our briefing. I want to draw your attention to the system of warning lights that we have set up. They are in front of you. When the light turns from green to yellow, that means that you have 2 minutes remaining. And when the light turns red, panelists should conclude their statements. So just wrap up what you're going to say. I don't want to interrupt you. That would be my preference. But we do have to be mindful of time. My fellow commissioners and I will do our part to keep our questions and comments concise. So in the order in which our panelists are speaking, we have with us today Patrick Sharkey, the William S. Todd Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs, Princeton University. We have John Lutt, President of Crime Prevention Research Center, John Paul Wright, Professor at the University of Cincinnati, Mallory O'Brien, Associate Scientist at the Johns Hopkins University, Rafael Mangual, Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and Mona Sahaf, Reshaping Prosecution Director at the Vera Institute of Justice. So I'm going to ask each of you to raise your right hand to take an oath. Will you swear and confirm that the information that you are about to provide us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief? Thank you so much. Dr. Sharkey, we can begin with you.
Great, thank you. This is a long day for all of you. Thanks for sticking with us. And also thanks to Bridget Brew and Latrice Fasci for, I hope I pronounced that right, for setting this up, putting it all together. So I'll use this opportunity to make 3 points about the lessons from research conducted on trends in violence from the 1990s to the present. And the first point I want to make is that the decline of violence that took place from the 1990s through the mid-2010s had its greatest impact on the most disadvantaged segments of the population. So from 91 to 2014, the U.S. murder rate fell by half, by more than half. And violence fell to some degree in almost every major city. It fell by 75% or more in cities like Los Angeles, Dallas, San Diego here in D.C., and elsewhere, completely transformed cities where violence fell to this degree. Equally important, the greatest impact of the crime decline was experienced by the most disadvantaged segments of the population and in the most disadvantaged communities. The simplest way to make this point is to look at lives lost. Dr. Michael Friedson and I conducted a study in which we estimated the effect of the national decline in murder on life expectancy and found that the crime drop should be seen as perhaps the most important public health advancement for black men of the past several decades. But the drop in violence in the 1990s didn't just save lives, it also improved academic performance, it narrowed racial gaps in achievement, it affected children's cognitive development, and separate research with Dr. Gerard Torres-Espinoza showed that declining violence in young people's communities has a causal impact on their probability of experiencing upward mobility, moving out of poverty as they reach adulthood. So the lesson here is that when violence falls, the most disadvantaged communities benefit the most. Point number 2, American cities remain vulnerable to rising violence because our nation's approach has relied primarily on aggressive policing, mass incarceration, and has not dealt with the prevalence of guns. I wrote a book on the decline of violence that was published in 2018 in which I argued that the fall of violence should be seen as a victory for urban America. And yet I titled the book Uneasy Peace. Why? Well, as I wrote in the preface, the decline in violence that changed urban America is fragile. So let me say this clearly. It is not possible to build a lasting, sustained peace through mass incarceration, through aggressive policing, through intensive surveillance targeted toward low-income communities of color. It is not possible to build a lasting peace when an unregulated supply of guns circulates through communities. it is not possible to build a lasting peace without investment designed to strengthen the local institutions that keep communities safe while also building stronger neighborhoods. In the years since that book came out, in 2018, my concerns about the fragility of the drop in violence have been borne out. From 2014 to 2022, the national murder rate has risen by 43%. A study I conducted with Elizabeth Marsteller showed that the rise of gun violence has been most pronounced in predominantly black neighborhoods and in low-income neighborhoods. And I just want to emphasize, this is not a broad rise in crime. This is purely a rise in gun violence. Gun crime is the only form of crime that has risen since 2019. So just as the most disadvantaged communities benefited the most when violence fell, those same communities have experienced the greatest impact of the recent rise of violence. Point number 3, a strong body of evidence points toward a new model to confront violence while building stronger communities. This latest rise of violence leaves us with a challenging question. How can we move forward with a new model that not only reduces violence, but also builds stronger neighborhoods, rebuilds trust between residents and law enforcement, and continues to reduce the massive scale of federal, state, and local systems of prisons and jails? And I'll conclude with 3 complementary approaches. The first is to invest in policies that allow law enforcement agencies to rebuild trust with the communities they serve. Federal and state funding can be used to support local law enforcement agencies through hiring more officers in cities and towns with insufficient resources to deal with the challenge of gun violence, and tying that funding to approaches explicitly designed to build trust and legitimacy. The second approach is to implement the most basic regulations of firearms in order to better track the circulation of guns and ensure that they are kept out of the hands of individuals with a history of mental illness, domestic violence, or serious crime. A study I published just a couple weeks ago with Megan Kang, a doctoral student at Princeton, found that the accumulation of basic state-level gun regulations passed in 40 states from 1991 to 2016 had a causal impact on reducing all forms of gun mortality, saving 4,000 lives annually. That's about 10% of gun deaths in the U.S. State regulations, many of which have broad public support across the political spectrum, including gun owners, have provided a clear template for how to reduce gun deaths nationally. The third and most important approach is to turn toward community residents and local organizations to play central roles in the effort to build safe, strong neighborhoods and cities. By this point, we have a large body of rigorous research, including experimental evaluations, making clear that local community organizations played a central role in contributing to the crime drop of the 1990s and can be remarkably effective in reducing violence. We as a nation have simply never given community organizations the resources they need to become central actors in the efforts to keep communities safe. So to summarize those 3 recommendations, support local law enforcement in the effort to rebuild trust, enact basic regulations on the sale of and access to guns, and turn toward community organizations to reduce violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharkey. We'll now hear from Dr. Lott, if you would please proceed.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate being invited here today. As we've heard many times today, blacks disproportionately face higher murder rates. People commit crimes primarily against people who are like themselves, both in terms of race and socioeconomic status. In my written testimony, I discuss how the costs of crime are much broader than just the direct victims of crime. And so I'm not going to go really through that right now. There are several points I want to make. One is single-parent families are a major contributing problem to all sorts of social problems, including crime. But unfortunately, the government has played a major role in the breakdown of families. Another point is, if you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, you'll have less crime. You can stop crime with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, but you can also do it by letting victims be able to go and protect themselves with guns. Every place in the world that has banned either all guns or all handguns that we have crime data for has shown murder rates and homicide rates go up every single time. If guns on net are bad, as some have argued, You would think it would be easy to find lots of places that have banned guns where you see murder rates go down or at least stay the same, and yet every time they go up. If by randomness, you'd think once or twice you would go and see that murder rates would go down, but yet they go up every single time. And the question is why? And the basic point is that when you ban guns, it's the most law-abiding good citizens who turn in their guns, not the criminals. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you may take a few guns away from criminals, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. And this point applies to gun control laws generally, not just bans. You have to be careful that the gun control laws that you're passing aren't going to primarily disarm the victims that are there. I just want to make a couple quick points from earlier panels. With all the discussion about guns, it's important to recognize that 92% of violent crime has nothing to do with guns. Firearms are not the leading cause of death of children, despite being referenced several times today. A number of references have been made to AR-15s. Just so people know, AR-15s are small caliber, semi-automatic hunting rifles. They just look different, but they function identically to any semi-automatic gun. About 85% of the guns in the United States are semi-automatics. Assault weapons have not reduced the mass public shootings, the ban that we had from 94 to 2004. There's one academic, Luis Colarrivas, has his own unique definition of mass shootings that he collects there, and that's the one that President Biden and others refer to constantly. But the problem that you have with that is that if you look at the percent of mass shootings, mass public shootings that involve assault weapons, even using his unique measure, it actually went up during that period of time. And the only way that could drive a decline is if the share fell over the period. As far as mass public shootings being a uniquely American problem that was mentioned by several of the people today, if you look over the last 20 years, the United States accounts for 4.6% of the world population, but 1% of the world's mass public shootings. There are many countries in Europe that have higher per capita rates of mass public shootings than the United States has. Guns in the home do not increase the risk of homicides and suicides. I can talk about that. I was chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and I can tell you the sentencing guidelines increase disparity rather than decreasing it. And academic research shows that poverty rates changes only explain 1 to 2% of the variation in crime rates. On to other things. If my research convinces me, if anything, it is the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having guns and are harmed the most by gun control. The people who benefit the most are two groups. The people who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. And unfortunately, gun control laws discriminate against the poor and minorities. Let me just talk about background checks as an example. We frequently hear that there are 4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been prevented from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is there have been 4 million initial denials, and virtually all of those, about 99% of those, are mistakes, false positives. The thing is, when you go and you buy a gun, you're providing all this information. What they do in the next background check is look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays. The problem is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 33% of black males are felons. 18% of Hispanic males are felons. 6% of white males are felons. 3% of Asian males are felons. Where are you most likely going to see the mistakes being made then when you have looking at things like roughly phonetically similar names? You're going to be discriminating against law-abiding, good black and Hispanic males simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name to somebody who's a felon, who's prohibited. If private companies did background checks in the same way that the federal government does, under federal law, they'd be sued out of business. Why can't we require that the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? You look at the fees. If I were to go and give John or somebody else here a gun here in D.C., we'd have to go through a background check. It costs $125 to do a background check on a private transfer of a gun. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm going to give one other person 4 guns. One person giving one other person 4 guns, you think it's just one background check because the same person is getting all guns. In D.C., in most of the other states that have these background checks, these universal background checks, they require a separate background check on each gun. So rather than $125, it would cost $500 for me to transfer the guns from one person to another. Give me a benign explanation for why that's set up that way, other than just to make it costly for law-abiding people who are trying to go out of their way to go and obey the law to be able to go and protect themselves and their families. There's no other benign explanation other than making it costly. Who do you think you're stopping? You're stopping poor people. And the same thing with the errors in the background check system. You have a situation where middle income.
Dr. Lott, if you could wrap
You've let people go
up.
for over a minute earlier today. I'm almost done.
Just go ahead and finish.
You have a system here where it's middle income and poor people who they can go and hire a lawyer to go and fix the mistakes in the background check system. But who wants to pay $3,000, even if they want to have a gun, even if they can afford to do it, just to fix a mistake that the government made and not the individuals? Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll turn to Dr. Wright.
Thank you very much. Criminologically speaking, we are in uncharted territory. In years prior, when asked about levels and rates of crime, we had reasonably accurate statistics generated from well-known processes. In recent years, that has changed, and it's changed dramatically, much of it stemming from COVID and the related social protests. As part of the pandemic response, for example, large parts of our economy, educational system, and more relevant to this panel, criminal justice system, were drawn down. The drawdown of the justice system was widespread and clearly impacted the data-generating processes used to estimate the volume and distribution of crime. For example, many police agencies instructed the public to avoid calling them unless the situation was dire, leaving many crimes not reported, not counted. Many courts suspended or scaled back operations, which reduced the flow of alleged offenders through the system. Probation offices stopped home and work verifications and all but shuttered, all but eliminating revocations due to technical violations and additional crimes. Many jails stopped admitting inmates or admitted only those accused of the most serious of crimes. This altered the arrest probabilities of police as they understood people would not be processed. I want to also note that in 2020, jail admissions fell 16%, daily jail populations dropped a remarkable 25%, and state and federal prison systems were reduced 8% within months, with more than 100,000 inmates released back into their communities, almost all of them without any meaningful supervision. As if COVID wasn't enough, the political reaction to the Floyd riots and protests had consequential effects on the police and the administration of justice. De-policing, especially in minority neighborhoods, became widespread. Proactive policing, already at very low levels owing to COVID, all but ceased. The effect of the defund movement, coupled with the riots and protests, was nothing short of remarkable. Police across the country retired or resigned in numbers never before witnessed. Several jurisdictions to this day triage calls for service, thus downwardly biasing estimates of crime. To reiterate, we're in uncharted territory when it comes to the measurement of crime. While there's reason to believe that some crime categories have declined, such as burglary, there's every reason to believe that crime generally or overall, and especially violent crime, which I'm most concerned about, has increased. The current picture of crime in America is complicated, and we have to be careful about extending too much credibility to crime estimates until we know more about the data-generating processes. That said, data show a clear, substantial increase in homicides and shootings beginning around 2012, 2013. However, homicides escalated an amazing 35% in 2020 over 2019 levels. None of this was predicted, by the way. Of course, aggregate trends in homicide mask very large trends between subgroups. Males and African Americans have always had significantly higher rates of homicide. African American homicide rates in February of 2019, just 1 year prior to COVID, was 18 per 100,000. 1 year later, it was 35 to 100,000. Since COVID and the social unrest, black-white differences in homicide rates have ranged between 25 to 35 to 1. To appreciate the dramatic increase in homicides from 2019 to 2022, consider that an additional 16,737 people were killed by criminal homicide between that period. Of these, an astonishing 10,800 were black victims. Making matters worse, much of the increase in black homicides and firearms injuries were disproportionately of the young, black, and male, with precipitous increases in juvenile violence. I'll add on top of that something less often considered, that 2 to 3 times as many people are shot who survive that shooting. Considering this fact, a minimum low estimate of about 91,000 additional African Americans were shot over this time period. Clearly, increases in violence, even small increases in violence, disproportionately impact the black community. Fortunately, we know today how better to manage crime and how to reduce it. The same social science that has documented the broad-scale deleterious effects of crime also tells us that the justice system reduces crime. For example, several studies show that increasing police levels reduces crime, largely through the effect of arrest. Hiring more police has been linked to reductions in auto thefts, burglaries, robberies, aggravated assaults, larceny, and homicide. Chalfin and McRae, for example, found that for every $1 spent on policing, it generated $1.63 in social benefits. More recently, Chalfin also found that the addition of each additional officer on a police force prevented 0.1 homicides, and that the effect was twice as large in black communities. Numerous studies have also documented substantial reductions in violent crime associated with the use of focused deterrence strategies. Overall, focused deterrence has been tried in cities across the U.S., and research finds a net crime reduction of around 64% when employed with integrity. What we do to those who are arrested also matters. Not prosecuting offenders and placing them immediately back on the street unsupervised is a recipe for more crime. Hogan's analysis of data from Philadelphia, for example, found that while the office reduced criminal sentences by 70%, it resulted in about 75 additional homicides per year from 2015 to 2019. Most of those homicides were of African Americans. And finally, while there are costs to incarceration, it is now obvious that there are also costs to not incarcerating. The difference has been pointed out in the literature is in who pays the price, the individual who commits the crime or the community in which they offend in. To conclude, government action should reduce harm to innocent, law-abiding people. It should not increase their risk by withdrawing critical public safety resources, especially in minority communities where crime is high and the consequences of victimization are most severe. Available data show that members of these communities desire more police, not less, and more policing. They want offenders prosecuted and off the streets, just like anyone else would if crime were prevalent in their neighborhood. Depriving these communities of necessary public safety resources, either intentionally through policy or by circumstance, should be thought of as a violation of their own civil rights and civil liberties. I can think of few things more cruel than to deny safety to those most in need, especially when we have the knowledge and skill sets to improve their lives. Finally, we need to abandon the anti-justice system narrative and reaffirm government's first priority of government, and that is the safety of all of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Now we're going to hear from Dr. O'Brien. If you could please proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. My testimony is going to focus on local data and hopefully provide some solutions to reduce the racial disparities that we're seeing in violent criminal victimization. I'm trained as an epidemiologist and have been working in this area of violence and overdose prevention for nearly 30 years. And I've really worked at the intersection of public health and public safety, and I had the opportunity to work at the local level, at the state level, and the federal level in public health and with criminal justice agencies. And what I've learned through that experience is that when we're talking about violence, we can't just focus on homicides. We really need to be able to look at non-fatal shootings, because non-fatal shootings occur 4 times as often as homicides. So if we really want to understand what's going on, we need to be able to look at the complete picture. And that information is so important to local communities to identify those prevention and intervention strategies that can reduce the violence that we're seeing. Unfortunately, non-fatal shooting data is not often collected. Law enforcement agencies collect information on homicides, aggravated assaults, armed robberies, but actually indicating if a person was injured by a firearm is not captured currently. And so what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time sharing with you what do we know at the local level. I was fortunate in 2005 to begin working with the city of Milwaukee and help develop with them a way to collect information and develop an infrastructure to really reduce violence in the city. And the data system that we created allowed us to look at not only homicides, but non-fatal shootings. And so we've heard today national data, and I just want to bring it home to the local level. So we heard this morning that the U.S. leads the world in rates of homicide. The rate actually in 2022 was 6.1. If we look at the state of Wisconsin, which is where I'm from, that number is 5.4 per 100,000. If we look at the city of Milwaukee, that number is 35.1. And when we look at black males, that number goes up to 118 per 100,000. If we look at black males between the ages of 15 and 34, that number escalates to 252 per 100,000. And that compares to 14.2 for white males in the same age group. So I can talk about national data, I can talk about state data and local data on homicides, but I can't for non-fatal shootings. When we look at non-fatal shootings, we don't have national data, we don't have state data. For the city, I can tell you that in 2022, the rate for non-fatal shootings was 132 per 100,000. The rate for black males was 554. The rate for black males between the ages of 15 and 34 was 1,235, compared to 38 for their white male counterparts. That's staggering. Those numbers are staggering. So what do? I'm not only coming with data, but I'm also coming with solutions. So my colleagues and I at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions have been working on a new model for reducing violence in our communities, and that model is called Violence Reduction Councils. And Violence Reduction Councils take a public health approach to what has traditionally been a law enforcement problem. And it starts with a different set of tools for our communities to tackle violence, both homicide and non-fatal shooting and violence in general. And data is the essential element of good decision making, and data from different frontline practitioners, as well as people with lived experience, can give us a much deeper picture of what's really going on that really helps us create those strategies to reduce violence. We need to create an environment for trust and collaboration, and violence reduction councils create a big tent, allowing all of us to work together. These councils are led by a neutral convener, somebody who has a background in public health, and they manage the pillars of a violence reduction council, which includes a governance structure, convening criminal justice partners, public health, and community, and it's underpinned with a data infrastructure that really allows communities to move forward on reducing violence and ultimately the disparities that we're seeing in victimization. This new framework for data modeling weighs relevant situational factors to give us that deeper perspective. Homicides and shootings are preventable. We hear time and again when we meet with individuals that we knew this was coming. So if we know it's coming, it's preventable. So how do we intervene in that cycle? How do we stop a shooting before it occurs? And more importantly, provide alternatives and support to people to keep them from resorting to violence in the first place. In one city that we worked, having that non-fatal shooting data led to the reduction in follow-on shootings and homicides. In another community that we worked, the community was able to develop a witness protection program customized specifically for their community. In Milwaukee, where this was pioneered, we were able to achieve nearly 50% decline in homicides using this approach. The whole premise here is on prevention, of being proactive before the homicide occurs or the non-fatal shooting occurs, rather than reactive after the fact. We at the center have been funded by the Bloomberg American Health Initiative to develop a comprehensive toolkit, data system, and trainings to share with communities to establish violence reduction councils of their own. This data system that I mentioned allows communities to capture rich information on homicides and non-fatal shootings. And today, there's a new public health approach to violence prevention. I just want to say, lastly, I've talked about data, and if we heard from Dr. Mercy this morning. CDC just celebrated that National Violent Death Reporting System at CDC celebrated its 20-year anniversary. And they now cover 50 states and U.S. territories on collecting detailed violent death data. It's time that we start capturing that same level of data with non-fatal shootings. The NIBR system has approved changes to improve collection of shooting information. We need to make sure that we're defining non-fatal shootings, as well as ensuring the participation of law enforcement agencies in the NIBR system. So I will leave you with a final statement. Collecting, analyzing, and translating local and national data on violent crime victimization in collaboration with police, public safety, and community at every level of government to develop and implement strategies, policy, and practice can reduce racial and ethnic disparities in victimization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien. We're going to go ahead and proceed with Mr. Mangual, if you would like to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation today. In my limited time, I want to make 3 points. First is that serious violence is up. The second is that increase has disproportionately impacted Black and Latino residents of this country who've long dealt with the brunt of the problems of homicides and gun violence. And third is that there's good reason to suspect that this loss in safety is at least partly driven by a shift in policing and criminal justice policy that can best be characterized as generally lowering the transaction costs of committing crime and raising the transaction costs of enforcing the law. On the first point, very quickly, nationally, in 2015 and 16, we started to see a decrease in public safety. Murders rose nearly 11% and 8% respectively in those years. The national homicide rate declined slightly in 2017 and 18 before ticking back upward in 2019. And then, of course, in 2020, the nation saw its largest single-year spike in homicides in at least 100 years, which was followed by another increase in murders in 2021. On the second point, that this has disproportionately impacted Black and Latino communities. The 2020 spike in homicide resulted in an additional 8 deaths per 100,000 Black residents in the U.S., while the white homicide rate increase resulted in an additional 0.5 deaths per 100,000 white residents. This pushed the Black homicide victimization rate in the United States up to 25.3 per 100,000 in 2020 from 19.5 per 100,000 in 2019, making the Black homicide victimization rate that year nearly 10 times higher than the white homicide victimization rate. Now, when one zeroes in on gun homicides, this pattern of racial disparities in victimization grows even starker, as is illustrated by the fact that the firearm homicide rate for Black men in the U.S. hit in 2021 its early 1990s peak of approximately 55 per 100,000. This represents a total erasure of the progress made on that measure between 1991 and the mid-2010s, which saw the Black male firearm homicide rate fall below 30 per 100,000 from more than 50 per 100,000. And you can also see these same racial disparities play out at the more local level when one zeroes in at the city and neighborhoods. In New York City, for example, where shootings and homicides increased by approximately 97% and 50% in 2020, and where both measures remain elevated compared to their pre-pandemic lows, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims and 85% of all homicide victims have been Black or Hispanic every single year, going back to at least 2008. In the city of Chicago, where 57.9% of the population is Black or Hispanic, those groups constituted 95% of homicide victims in 2019, 96% in 2020, 96% in 2021, and 95% in 2022. A recent cross-sectional study of 129,826 adult men living in the city of Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles in 2020 and 21, which was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, found that, and I'm going to quote here, young males from zip codes with the most violence in Chicago and Philadelphia had a notably higher risk of firearm-related death than U.S. military personnel who served during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, if you think about that for a moment and you put yourself in the position of a mother sending her child off to the Marines at the age of 19 in 2003, and you think about the fear that that mom would naturally feel at that moment that her son might not make it home, consider the fact that every single day in this country there are mothers who take the same chance with their sons' lives simply by sending them to school in their own neighborhoods. Now on to the third point, the suspicion that this decrease in safety, which has disproportionately impacted blacks and Latinos, is due to a shift in criminal justice policy. As my co-panelist, Patrick Sharkey, has noted in the past, quote, even the staunchest critics of mass incarceration acknowledge that the expansion of the imprisoned population contributed to the decline in violence. And, quote, the best evidence that we have makes clear that police are effective in reducing violence, such that, quote, one of the most robust and most uncomfortable findings in criminology is that putting more officers on the streets leads to less violent crime. Now, he's right on both counts, and I cite these acknowledgments because over the last decade plus, both policing and incarceration have taken hits. Between 2010 and 2016, police departments across the country have seen increases in oversight actions. Over the last 10 to 20 years, the country has seen federal and state sentencing reforms, bail reforms, discovery reforms, decriminalization efforts aimed at drugs and theft offenses, successful litigation efforts targeting police practices or incarceration levels, and a slew of often hasty state and local police reforms aimed at restricting police powers and discretion. We've also seen the explosion of the progressive prosecutor movement, such that now some 70 million Americans live in jurisdictions with prosecutors who have used their discretion to limit the ability of line prosecutors with respect to seeking pretrial detention, opposing parole, and pursuing sentencing enhancements. Now, these shifts individually and collectively seem to have reduced the likelihood of arrest or prosecution and or incarceration for many offenders, which is a problem. And the reason that's a problem is because the serious problem of violent crime, particularly gun violence, has long been driven by repeat offenders. A study done in the city of Chicago found that the typical homicide or shooting suspect in 2015 and 16 had 12 prior arrests. Nearly 1 in 5 had more than 20 prior arrests, a measure that's in line with one that was cited by former Metro Police Chief Robert Conte here in the city of D.C., who said that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to them committing a homicide. In the city of Baltimore, various studies of homicides in 2017 and 18 found that homicide suspects that had been identified had 9 prior arrests, and that more than a third of them were on parole or probation. And then nationally, between 1990 and 2002, more than a third of those convicted of violent felonies in America's 75 largest urban counties were on parole, probation, or pretrial release at the time of their offense, and 75% of them had a prior arrest history. The reality is that serious violent crime, particularly gun violence, is and has long been driven by repeat offenders who have been given multiple bites at the apple, and they use those bites at the apple to victimize people living in the communities in which they would otherwise spend their time. That has led to a loss of life, one that we should do something about by treating that issue as a civil rights concern. When the government takes affirmative steps to change policy, and that policy has disproportionate impacts on low-income minority communities, this body has in the past shown interest in examining that as the civil rights issues that they are. It should do the same here. We've heard a lot about preventing violence, and that is something that I dedicate my work to. But the single best way to prevent a shooting is by keeping shooters off the street. And our policy throughout this country over the last several years has been calculated to minimize that effect, to keep shooters on the street. And that's what needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mangwa. Ms. Sahaf?
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Mona Sahaf, and I work at the Vera Institute of Justice, where I'm the director of our Reshaping Prosecution program. My team uses research and evidence to help prosecutors increase public safety by shrinking the front end of the criminal system, addressing racial disparities in prosecution that make us less safe, and increasing collaboration with communities that are most impacted by DA's decisions. Before joining the Vera Institute, I was a prosecutor for 12 years at the federal level here in Washington, D.C., where I prosecuted general violent crime, domestic violence, national security matters, fraud. I then worked at DOJ headquarters in the Human Rights Special Prosecution Section, where I investigated and prosecuted cases around the country, including crime that occurred at U.S. military bases and embassies abroad. Having worked in criminal courts for 15 years and met with hundreds of victims and their families, I have seen firsthand how the criminal legal system fails to meet the needs of crime survivors, makes us less safe, and discounts the safety of people of color, lower income people, and LGBTQ people. ample research that we've heard about all day backs these observations. A 2022 National Survey of Crime Victims showed that crime continues to impact most Americans. Indeed, 6 of every 10 people were a victim of crime in the past 10 years. About half of them were victims of violent crime. However, according to DOJ's findings, the majority of victims of violent crime, the last census tells us that 58%, continue not to report their crimes to police. And this reluctance greatly hinders our government's ability to deliver public safety because we don't know where the crimes are occurring. Data also tells us that crime does not impact communities equally, and we've heard a lot about that today, but let me just refresh a couple statistics. Victims are more likely to be young people, people of color, from low-income communities, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and people with criminal records. For example, according to DOJ, young people aged 18 to 29 are 18% of our population, but are nearly 30% of the victims of violent crime. DOJ data also tells us that gay people face violent victimization twice the rate of heterosexual people, and that transgender people experience violence at 2.5 times the rate of non-transgender communities. You've also heard ample data around the disproportionate impact of crime on Black communities. Black children and adults aged 15 to 34 are victims of gun homicides 20 times the rate of white children and adults, for example. So from this disheartening data, we know which communities are at the greatest risk of victimization, and to address disparities, we have to target more resources and interventions to them to help them heal from past trauma that causes future trauma and to protect them from future victimization. Also, government actors need to adopt evidence-based reforms that reduce reliance on tools that have not made us safe. We've heard earlier today, it's come down a little bit, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's population. That's not making us safer. If it was, we would be the safest. These tools are not working for us. And research has shown that increased incarceration has only minimal impacts on crime rates, and that those impacts are primarily on property crime, not violent crime. Additionally, the criminogenic impacts of incarceration are very well documented. In other words, incarceration is associated with increasing rates of crime. For example, for people charged with felony offenses, each additional year of incarceration can increase the likelihood of their future contact with the system by 4 to 7 percentage points and reduce their chances of employment, which we know creates stability and helps reduce crime, by 3.6 percentage points. Unfortunately, many policymakers continue to call for charging more, detaining more, and incarcerating people for longer periods, despite the lack of evidence that doing so would make us safer. But fortunately, there are alternatives that have been shown to significantly increase safety without levying the heavy social costs of policing incarceration on communities. One are diversion policies. So more police and prosecutors are using diversion programs to address the underlying drivers of crime, be them substance abuse issues, mental health issues, poverty, joblessness, lack of recreation for youth. And these diversion programs have far better outcomes than the traditional system. Our status quo system is failing by any kind of grade. If my kids brought me back a grade of our criminal system that shows that 8 years out, 80% of people have been rearrested or reconvicted, I kick them out. So diversion programs, on the other hand, their outcomes are much better. For example, a study of diversion programs in Texas found that diversion, so intentionally addressing the crime apart from the criminal system, outside of the system, decreased a person's future convictions by 48% over a 10-year period and improved their employment outcomes by 53% over the same period. Another thing we can employ are declination policies, so choosing to decline certain charges in absolution. So this is even apart from programming. This is what the research shows us. In Suffolk County, Massachusetts, in 2019, the DA instituted a policy presumption, so not categorically, but a presumption not to charge certain low-level nonviolent offenses. A rigorous study of this policy showed that not charging people actually decreased their chances of future involvements substantially. Researchers also found no increase of nonviolent misdemeanors reported to police, so no apparent public safety impacts from charging people less. Just simply charging people less, keeping them out of the system, make communities safer. In another example, in Minnesota, DA John Choi there has implemented a policy with several police chiefs to decline to charge cases and to conduct fewer low-level traffic stops. Traffic stops particularly based on equipment and paperwork violations. The harms associated with traffic stops are well documented and were acutely felt there in Ramsey County, Minnesota, where Philando Castile was killed during his 49th traffic stop over a 13-year period. Law enforcement there knew these traffic stops drove racial disparities, were destroying trust with communities that they need to deliver safety to and whose cooperation they need to deliver safety throughout the county. And 2 years later, we have analysis of these policies. So again, police chiefs with the district attorney doing less. and they found massive drops in racial disparities and no apparent public safety impacts based on 911 call volumes or the number of guns taken off the streets. So a full success, and I've been at community meetings there, and the amount of trust that's been rebuilt with communities of color who are so proud of their DA and so proud of their police chiefs who are doing things to make them safer was palpable in the room, and I heard from many community members about this. And finally, we also have good evidence around community violence intervention programs, focused deterrence strategies that target those at greatest risk of committing or being victimized by gun crime. They've had great results in cities like Baltimore, Chicago, New York City. And in contrast to our system, they are looking to prevent crime before it occurs, not after it occurs. The Commission is uniquely situated to support communities that are disparately impacted by helping target resources to these communities that we know bear the brunt of the harms, supporting the use and funding of evidence-based interventions, and perhaps now more than ever, speaking up against those calling for more prosecution, greater penalties, and more incarceration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Saha. Thank you to all of our panelists for your testimony. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to open up the floor to commissioners for questions. If there are none initially here on the floor, I'll turn it over to the folks on the phone and give them an opportunity. Please speak up and I will recognize you.
Madam Chair, Kirsten here.
Yes, Commissioner Kirsanow, please proceed.
Thank you very much. This is my question, I suppose, would be for Professor Wright. Despite the fact that I've been on the commission for quite some time, this is the first time that I've regularly heard the term over-policing. Now, I happen to live in the same inner-city Cleveland neighborhood, high-crime neighborhood for the last 40 years, and that's a term that none of my neighbors have ever utilized. They've always said, where are the police? We want more police. Does over-policing artificially inflate crime numbers and result in greater victimhood of black or victimization of blacks?
I think the argument that certain communities are over-policed is misplaced. Most police, if you look at the way they spend their time, is highly reactive. 911 calls, a certain fraction of those outside of 911 calls are driven by victims stopping them or people requesting their assistance, and then the smallest fraction being that they initiate contact and conduct criminal investigation out of that. And with that said, you go to where the problem is. And police allocation of resources, and this is what some of the focused deterrence literature tells us, that you don't have to flood an area with blue, right? That you can be highly selective, that you can use various types of crime analytics and street level and operational level intelligence to selectively arrest and hopefully incapacitate people that are driving crime in those areas. I think, as was mentioned earlier, most of the shootings, and I work in Cincinnati with the Gun Crime Intelligence Center, the CPD and ATF, most of the shootings are by recidivists, people that have extensive criminal histories. It's not at all surprising. And they use remarkable levels of effort and intelligence so that they no longer have to flood an area. Give you contrast real quick, there used to be a unit called the Vortex, and it was like a strike team, and it was effective, but it also generated a lot of community backlash. Thus far, the Gun Crime Intelligence Center has received widespread support, in large part also because it brings in community members, and we have social workers on staff, and we work with violence interrupters. So, long-winded way of saying that I don't believe that you have to flood an area with police or have what would be called over-policing, that you can do so much more intelligently.
Commissioner Harriet?
I think probably Dr. Wright's the first person to at least start with on my question too, but anybody who wants to comment, I would appreciate. I feel awash in statistics, and I understand that things can be you know, we could probably improve what we have, but I'm sort of looking for what's the most reliable, you know, most reliable numbers out there. And I understand the notion that murder is probably better measured than things like, because the opposite end might be simple assault, but there's a lot in between. You know, which numbers strike you as the most reliable?
We're pretty good at counting dead bodies. And after that, auto theft.
Auto theft?
Auto theft numbers are fairly accurate. Yeah, if someone steals your car, you have to turn it in for insurance.
Yes,
So,
I get it.
you know, where we see typically the most serious types of crimes, you have higher reporting. Generally speaking, as when you start to move down that chain into property crimes, you see less reporting. And oftentimes, NCVS has shown this, you know, for many, many years.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think Dr. Wright's exactly right that homicide and auto theft are probably our two most reliable measures because those are the things that are hardest to fudge and where, you know, people have the greatest incentive to actually report the offenses. But I do think it's important for us, you know, to consider, particularly with respect to the last few years, that we have to really do more work to understand other kinds of crime statistics. I'll take, you know, robbery and assault, for example. Now, those numbers have gone up in a lot of places, although not everywhere, but they certainly haven't gone up nearly as much as homicides and shootings have gone up. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that since the pandemic in 2020, there has been a real change in what criminologists call routine activities. People are spending significantly less time on the street. They're spending less time in commercial settings. If you look at all kinds of data measures, so there was a study done by the University of Toronto looking at cell phone data that found that foot traffic in New York City was down 33% in the business districts. JP Morgan put out a report in 2022 showing that the majority of the consumer spending recovery in 2021 was driven by online spending as opposed to in-person spending. The MTA puts out regular surveys of ridership, still showing that 3 years after the pandemic, subway ridership is only 70% of what it was prior to the pandemic. All of this means that people are spending significantly less time in the places where they might be victimized. So when we look at the raw numbers of these offenses, we have to use our ability to analyze and understand that the risk has actually gone up significantly more once you control for the amount of time that people are actually spending in public spaces.
Vice Chair Nurse?
Yes, I'm awash in data too. So Professor Sharkey, I wonder if you could, I'm going to raise it 3 different sets of data and maybe you can help me. We've been told in various panels that crime is up. That's a very general term. I mean, all of you people have spent your life studying crime, right? You know all the sources of data, right? So if you look on your website of the FBI, they say that murder and non-negligent manslaughter recorded a 2002 estimated national decrease of 6.1% compared to the previous year, and that violent crime overall in the nation has decreased an estimated 1.7%. Now, I understand the National Crime Victimization Survey may differ from that, but do you have any reason to doubt this set of numbers?
No, I think, so what we know is that in 2020 there was a huge increase in gun violence, and that was just gun violence exclusively. Since then, in 2021 it was high again. Last year we had a very sharp decline, one of the largest declines ever, year-to-year declines. And this year, we're having an even larger decline. So the increase since 2020 is very real, and we should not downplay that. We should also celebrate the progress, and thousands of lives are going to be saved this year compared to last year and compared to 2020. So we shouldn't doubt those numbers. Those numbers are solid. We should, as Dr. Wright said, we should be focusing on murder. I think shootings are also measured pretty well at this point. And those figures tell us that last year and this year we're seeing sharp declines.
Now let me ask you another thing. You know, I said at the beginning of my statement that there's a lot of slogans, you know, progressive prosecution, defund the police, and that gives people misleading impressions. So, for example, the U.S. prison population appears to have gone up 2% in 2021. Would that seem unusual to you?
That the
Prison population went up 2% in 2021.
I don't track that as closely as violence. The prison population has been falling,
It has, yeah.
pretty steadily since 2008 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's recently gone up. And then funding for police went up for 83% of 100 cities. And I really don't like to rely on the news sources of data. This is from ABC News recently, because a lot of people hear these slogans and they think, oh, we don't have police anymore. I mean, I understand they took a huge hit during COVID, and Professor Wright is absolutely correct on that. But local communities aren't stopping to spend, are they?
No, there's been no defunding of the police. The only suggestion to defund the police is coming from the right, defund DOJ and FBI. It's a bad idea. I think, I try to kind of toe the line that we cannot take away responsibility from law enforcement until we have built other institutions and funded other institutions to step up and play a larger role.
Well, I think that that's what a lot of people are saying. And finally, let me ask one question of Dr. O'Brien while I have the mic on. I have a slide up here. We've been told that the CDC data on firearm-related injuries may be wrong, but according to this, it says that from 2019 to the present day, there's been a 33.4 increase in firearm homicides from 2019 to 2020. Is that consistent with your understanding?
And that data is based on information that's captured at the state level from medical examiners and the local level. So that data is solid data. They have people that are abstracting it on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Commissioner Jones?
I think that some of the panelists wanted to respond to some of these questions, Dr. Lott and Mr.
Well,
Mungwal.
I think the chair is the one who's governing that, and everyone else should kind of mute themselves in the meantime.
Well, just to point out that they've not been permitted to speak then.
Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for recognizing me. Earlier on in this panel, I heard probably the greatest concentration of disinformation that I've seen in such a short time span. I served on the House Judiciary Committee with Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz. The wackiest, probably, thing to emerge from this panel is somehow the idea that because of the commonality of black names, that universal background checks would not be effective at stemming the uniquely American problem of gun violence. And then, of course, there was also disinformation about what an assault weapons ban would actually accomplish. And so, Professor Sharkey, you're someone who's brought a lot of analytical rigor to your scholarship. Is there anything you'd like to respond to that was stated by Mr. Lott, for example, earlier on today's panel?
Well, this is a really hard topic to study, and I do think, there needs to be improvements in research, and over time there have been steady improvements. The virtual consensus. So, Dr. Lott has published a lot of research on gun laws. I think it's safe to say that most of that research has been debunked at this point. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the consensus that has emerged is that the argument that more guns leads to less crime is wrong. What we know is that there are a set of policies, most of them enacted at the state level. That's where we get the variation that we need to come close to identifying causal effects. Some of those policies, the most common ones that have been shown time and again to be causal and effective at reducing gun deaths. And I'm going to say gun deaths because it's not just homicides, it's suicides and gun accidents as well, are universal background checks, waiting periods, prohibited possessor laws, which do not allow people with domestic violence history or records to have access to guns. Now, other policies have much more mixed evidence. I think concealed carry laws, which Dr. Lott has studied, have mixed evidence. I'm not going to come out and say that there's slam dunk evidence that violence is going to fall next year if we get rid of concealed carry laws. So the body of evidence needs to improve. That said, what we know is that the accumulation of regulations that make it more difficult for people who shouldn't have a gun to access guns, that make it more difficult for dealers who will sell to anyone who walks in the door to stay in business, that makes it more difficult for children to access guns. These kinds of policies, when they accumulate, save thousands and thousands of lives, and that's causal. So it's not an accident that the states with the most restrictive gun regulations have the lowest rates of gun deaths. It's not an accident that's the nations with the most guns have the most gun deaths. You know, this evidence has accumulated, and there's virtually every scientist who studies this reaches this conclusion. And the ones who reach the opposite conclusion are the ones that get called on over and over. But it's like the climate change deniers. You know, you can find one or two who are going to dispute the evidence. Virtually everyone else is on the same page.
Thank you, Professor.
Go ahead, Dr. Lutt.
Your microphone.
Professor Sharkey didn't deal with what I thought was the most basic part of the question, is are there mistakes in the background check system? And, you know, just to give you an idea here, one of the big criticisms have been made when you have a Democratic president. Republicans say Democrats aren't enforcing the gun control laws. When there's a Republican president, Democrats say that. What's Exhibit A is the denials in the background check system. You almost never see prosecutions. You may say 200,000 times that people have been stopped because of the background check system. You see 20 prosecutions and 12 convictions. Why do you see so many? If you actually go and talk to the people who are involved in the prosecutions, they would say these are like the easiest things to go and prosecute people for. The reason why they're not prosecuting people is because they're not real cases. It's one thing to go and stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to the person who you want to stop. And so I have no problem with background checks, okay? My problem is that the current background check system discriminates against the very people who need guns the most for protection. Law-abiding, poor, black people who live in high-crime urban areas. And there's no reason anymore. If you were to go to a private company and say, should you do background checks on people that look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays, they will look like you're from Mars, because they're going to say you're going to be discriminating against minorities. You're going to create lots of false positives. If it's nuts for private companies to go and do background checks like that, why is it okay for the federal government in the NICS system to go and do that? Why, if you have 4 million people where almost all of those are mistakes, how is that justifiable? You know, there's a reason why you don't have prosecutions for these cases, whether it's across Democratic or Republican administrations. Now, with regard to the claims that my research has been debunked, I can give you dozens of peer-reviewed studies. In fact, there are many more that have found my research has stood up to all these different types of tests that are there. And I look at more than concealed carry. I've looked at many different types of gun control laws that are there. And as far as background checks, I wish it had the impact. Waiting periods actually have been associated with increases in violent crime rates, for rape rates. You know, you may have a cooling off period, but you also make it difficult for victims, let's say a woman who's being stalked or threatened, to be able to quickly be able to go and get a gun for self-defense. And so you have to go and look at the net effect that's there. As far as the assault weapons ban goes, I'll just give you, again, just a simple statistic. And that is, if the assault weapons ban actually worked, you should have seen the share of attacks involving assault weapons fall during the period when the ban was in effect. In fact, what you see is that the share of attacks went up when the assault weapons ban went into effect, and it fell when it went after. But why one would think that a ban on guns based on how they look rather than how they function is going to make any difference? You know, when Senator Feinstein's staff went through catalogs to go and look at guns based on how they look rather than how they function, when they're functionally identical guns that were still available there, makes no sense to me. But I'm sure other people on the panel may have thoughts about that. But I'm more than happy to give dozens of papers that have found my work even stronger effects than I have. And the thing is, if you look at the studies that tend to argue against me, look at later periods of time. And what happens is, if you look at the period, let's say, from 2000 on, in these studies, you're comparing how the crime rates are changing in the states that changed those laws during those later periods versus all the states that adopted right to carry laws before that. In fact, the later states were much more restrictive. They had higher fees, longer training periods. They actually saw smaller increases in concealed carry permits than the earlier states. So the positive effect that they have there is actually the opposite of what they think it is, because what you really want to look at is the percent of the population with the permits, and there are other issues I could go into.
Thank you, Dr. Lott. We're going to be mindful of time here, so if we could keep our comments a little bit shorter. We'll go to Commissioner Jones. I don't know if you had another question.
Madam Chair, that's a lot to respond to that we just heard. A lot more disinformation, frankly.
What did I say that was wrong?
Almost everything, sir. And by the way, I'm looking at a 2-page document, just probably 20 different examples of how you've been called out for erroneous statements, much of which looks to be deliberate. But one of the things you added today, you suggested, in fact, you stated explicitly that, you mentioned 4 million names, and you said almost all of those background searches have been inaccurate. Do you want to clarify that statement?
No, I don't want to clarify.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Could you respond to the Inspector General's report that revealed that these background check denials are accurate in 99.8% of the cases?
Okay, what they did was they looked at 400, quote, judiciously sampled observations there. I don't know why, you would want to look at a random sample if you're going to look at that small of a group. But there's no reason to look at that small of a sample. We have the entire thing there. We know, for example, you can go and look through, there's basically 5 stages of review that occur when a NICS background check occurs. The first stage of review is the National BATF office. We'll look at them about...
Todd, I just want you to respond to the question.
I apologize. I just kind of want to move us along if I can, because I feel like there's some other. I have not had the opportunity to ask a question. I am really grateful to have heard specifically from Dr. O'Brien and Ms. Sahef about some of the things that have been echoed this morning about what we talked about. And to me, what I keep hearing is that there's a lack of data, of reliable data. I know we talked about homicide as being the most reliable because you have a body, unfortunately. But, shootings, as you had mentioned, non-fatal shootings, the fact that that's not being tracked, I mean, that is a big problem, is it not?
So there is hospital data, and there is hospital data from emergency department visits that track non-fatal shootings. But it doesn't give us the detail that we need, like where, why, how can we prevent? And until we start getting that level of data on non-fatal shootings like we have on homicides, communities are at a loss, because if you're looking at gun violence, you really need to look at the totality of non-fatal shootings and homicides. And I started only looking at homicides. And I'm like, what is going on here? And where are the non-fatal shootings? I thought there was a fraction of the non-fatal shootings until I actually started pulling all the data. And when you start pulling all of it and understand the bigger picture, it really helps communities at the local level, and that data then flows up to the national level. We have a much better understanding of what's going on and how we can prevent and how we can intervene.
Go ahead, Mr. Mangual.
If I could just quickly add to that, I mean, in addition to the non-fatal shootings in which people are wounded, we should also be doing more to track non-fatal shootings in which no one's wounded. And one of the best ways to do that is to see jurisdictions more broadly adopt technology like ShotSpotter, using acoustic technology to identify the firing of gunshots. Now, a huge portion of ShotSpotter alerts do not see accompanying 911 calls, which tells us that non-fatal gun violence is actually more common than even the data that we do have is. But I would note that there's been a lot of opposition on the left in this country to the adoption of ShotSpotter on the claim that it sends police resources into minority neighborhoods, which we've heard time and again see the brunt of this problem. I just wanted to note that.
And I wanted to bring in Ms. Sahef into this if I can. I think that your comment made me think a lot about, investment in communities, right? Because that's what we need to do, or at least that's what we've heard all morning. It's data and it's investment in the communities. And I'm a Texan, so I was particularly struck by that diversion program having that much of a success. I'm also, I practice criminal defense and have represented children. And my dad was a district court judge in the 80s and 90s, so I come from a family of folks that understand law enforcement and the criminal justice system as a whole. But I wanted to bring you in if you want to add anything.
Sure, I appreciate it. I have a lot of different, so my team is public defenders, former public defenders and prosecutors, and some really incredible scientists with similar bona fides to folks here. And I've sometimes had like tech folks come and say, what is the solution? Is it ShotSpot or what is it? And I have incredible data scientists who say no, who understand tech and use it, and they don't think tech is the solution, and I wish it was. I understand the attraction for that, but the solution is, more money to communities at the local level. I also echo what an earlier panel said, is we already know what the solutions are. People who with lived experience who are doing the work, they know what the solutions are already. And we need to collect more data to back up those stories, but we have a lot of evidence already about what works, but they need more funding and money. My organization sometimes gives sub-grants to help people build diversion programs, but the question is when we leave, what's going to happen? They are desperate for funding. So we have a lot of solutions that work, but the money is not getting to the folks to make sure things are sustainable and can be built. I have people doing restorative justice programs who are like, we want to scale it, but they need the money. So I think it's good to know that there is some data collection, it's imperfect, but we already have really good guidance from the data and from people who are doing the work, and we really just need to give them whatever they ask for, they know.
Could you just explain what a diversion program is for our audience?
Absolutely. So diversion doesn't have a perfectly even definition across, but really I think of it as ways to solve. So when criminalized behavior occurs, when a crime occurs, and even that's fraught, as we know, when we talk through how we measure crime rates, etc. But it's finding a way to address crime and harm outside of the criminal system. So in a way that would not end up with somebody getting a conviction, because we know those carry so many collateral consequences that make us safer and help make those citizens, deal with major uphill battles to becoming productive, thriving members of society, and tend to drive programs and resources to whatever the underlying drivers are of people's conduct. I tell people all the time, my kids are in camp in the summer, and so they're occupied. They have something to do. If you're not occupied, if you don't have recreation, if you're not in good schools, if you don't have health care, if you don't have safe child care, these are all the things that cause people to get caught up in criminal activity, and it does include absolutely over-policing. It does. If you live in a detached house and you're arguing with your spouse, no one's calling the cops. And if you live in a narrow apartment building and there's thin walls and noise, absolutely policing does not reflect where all the crime is occurring. Crime is occurring all over the place, but who is being policed is very much driven by other factors. So diversion programs find ways to address services to whatever's the underlying driver of the crime. Maybe it's mental health or substance abuse, joblessness, mentoring, outside of the criminal system. For example, you'll often see in the criminal system, you need to, serve this much time and this fine, maybe community service. But if you have a mental health issue that's driving your criminal conduct, the community service is never really going to get you to where you need to go. So it's, our recommendation is always services provided in community-based organizations that are tied to those communities, that know what the needs are, that have, access to mentors, jobs, resumes, substance abuse, apart from the system, because we've also heard a lot today around the many, many reasons many people don't want to interact with the system. They're not there, and we know that there's a lot of harm that's been inflicted. So finding ways to address crime outside of the criminal legal system.
Thank you. We have time for one question. I really appreciate the robust conversation. Thank you. Commissioner McIntyre.
Not a question, it's a moment of gratitude. Thanks. Ms. Hafe, I actually wanted more of those details, so that was great. I just want to thank Raphael, who actually serves on the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We served on the committee a number of years. I think you're still on it. Wanted to thank you for your service to the New York Advisory Committee and for this testimony. And, of course, all of you, thank you for sharing and taking your time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much again for the robust conversation. You've given us a lot to consider. Thank you for your testimony. We will be looking at that as we develop our report. So I'm going to ask all the attendees to continue any conversations you want to have outside of the hearing room so our staff can prepare the room for, no?
Just go ahead and end it and then we'll talk.
Okay. Okay. We're recessing.